Hello everyone, today we talk about Renaissance warfare and give a look more specifically to the recruitment and lifestyle of 16th and 17th century armies, focusing chiefly actually on the Spanish ones. And we will also be reading you know, almost a chapter actually from the picaresque novel of the Spanish writer Mateo Alemán, named Guzmán de Alfarache. I believe that's the correct pronunciation. That exemplifies in many ways these aspects of that are very important because what the picture that emerges from here, as always, is that war is fundamentally a business. And a very tough one, definitely, one that presented a lot of internal competition aside from naturally the dangers of war and the dire conditions that it obviously it entails. Given a context, we haven't been talking much about Renaissance warfare actually, because I decided to give this tiny space, and we mostly approached it from even sometimes literary perspectives, like we will be doing today. But it's still very important to understand. I'm not actually an expert. I believe that Renaissance warfare is very fascinating, but essentially that's where I also start losing a bit contact with the sources. I rely mostly on bibliographical knowledge, etc. But nevertheless, that's the reason why starting from the sources is very important, as always. So why the Spanish army actually? But well, because as you know, the Spanish army in this period, we will be talking roughly between the 16th and the half of the 17th century, was definitely the most powerful military in Europe. It had been developing several characters, including a certain degree of permanence, of professionalism. It was an army that definitely also was very tactically advanced and sophisticated. You know that from the Italian wars, the armies of the Spanish crown that had been unified, at least dynastically speaking, with Castilla and Aragon in the second half of the 15th century, emerged as the leading military system, fundamentally, from the very field that they will maintain actually for until the army of the French army of Louis XIV was built up. And there are many characters of this army. This army was naturally considered the pride of Spain in itself. You know, especially the tercio, as it was called in Spanish, the tercio español, the Spanish third. That was this powerful Spanish infantry division during the time of Habsburg Spain that became famous for its victories on the European battlefields during this period, and it also made so proud the soldiers that belonged to it. So that there is also this stereotypical national cliche of the Spanish soldiers, very cocky, arrogant, full of itself, because at the time, objectively, still, you know, the military ethos was fed by such pride that had been won, in fact, by the Spanish armies with their victories on the field. The Spanish army was, as you know, the tercio was recruited actually not just in Spain but also in its dependencies. The Spanish army at this time was full of Italians, of Germans, of Flemish. And therefore I think it brilliantly represents at this time the growing European interconnection that starts occurring, or at least that gets accelerated during the early modern age, with new military systems that are being experimented, new problems that are posed by strategical reasons. Think about the same Habsburgic dominions that at this time controlled a great part of the world, but from Spain, and with from naturally Austria as the motherland. So the dependency of the empire, and then the Americas and all the other colonies there started, and naturally also the Spanish Flanders, with the Burgundian inheritance of the Habsburgs in there. and therefore the battles of Europe are kind of widened. We will see it now. But it's still important because it makes you understand how much the military systems at this time were being enhanced in order to be functional, even at such distances, and in this prolonged warfare that characterizes, if you want, this quite dramatic moments of European history. Especially the 16th century. We often see, as a medievalist, I have to make this this criticism, because we see it as the moment of great evolution, which is definitely true in many ways. But at the time, it was actually perceived as a dramatic moment in history. They felt, especially not much the cultural shock coming from the discovery of New World. But even more than that, definitely the wars of religion, the Great Schism, the Lutheran Reform, and all the wars that in fact ensued also on the base of this religious wars of religion, and so on, that engulfed the continent and especially certain areas. So the Spanish army in this context it can be seen as kind of a joint fundamentally between the it's definitely a Renaissance army. It's the best thing you can think. Iconically speaking, the Tercio it actually survived, if I'm not wrong, until the 30s of the 18th century. Actually, even the Battle of Rocroi, that has been mostly thought by the French as this massive, this end of the Spanish Tercio is actually, it's been overly emphasized. There was a progressive transformation, but definitely the moments of glory of the Tercio came with the Pike&Shot tactics. So in a moment that eventually in the second half of the 17th century starts declining. It's an army that brings to its most mature conclusions what the 15th, say second half of the 15th century warfare had been in Europe, starting with the squares of pikemen that the Swiss had invented. Basically, the Spanish put together all the tactical elements with the pikemen, the arquebusier, the rodelero, so these kind of also assault troops with a sword and shield, etc., and artillery naturally that they also start to develop together with France, etc. But Spain is the one that had kind of the most complete army in this sense, and kind of made it tactically even towards this, thanks to this kind of balance. But aside from this, and as we're recalling before, Spain at this time starts having a sort of national character, especially during the 16th century. The Spanish army we've seen it was kind of a multinational in many ways in terms of origin of the single soldiers, but fundamentally the majority of the Spanish troops came from the desolated Castilla. You know that Castilla is this was the biggest chunk actually of Spain. It was the leading crown in the Iberian Peninsula during the actually still during this time, because there was still effectively up to very late in time not a real statal unification of the crowns. These were formally still the Castilla and Aragon were two separated kingdoms, but Castile was the most powerful one. It was the one that it was the largest, it was the most tightly controlled by the crown, for reasons now we don't have time to explain. And it was also, I believe, the most populous, but also especially the one that, and it wasn't particularly populated. Actually, the whole Iberian Peninsula had a very low demographic density compared to places like Italy or the Flanders. The Spanish didn't have actually a lot of manpower, but definitely their society was oriented historically towards this inclination for the exercise of arms, especially in Castilla, because Castilla had been historically, with the Reconquista, at the frontier with the Islamic world. And fundamentally the Castilian gentry, the hidalgos, came to had been kind of specializing in this military role. I mean, they really felt, especially at the end of the Reconquista, the Spanish in general thought themselves to be the real heroes of the situation that had wiped out the Muslim presence from the Iberian Peninsula, and now Spain was all Christian. Even the Jews were often converted with violence, etc. So this was the moment of their great glory. Now they were winning everywhere. They were winning they had conquered the New World. They were winning in Italy. They were winning in the lowlands. They were really full of themselves because of their chivalric mindset that they had developed like that. I had a colleague at university back that wrote a master thesis exactly on. He was actually writing on other things, but he was into Spanish history of the time. He told me that basically like 1/3 of the freemen in Spain at this point were hidalgos. Like the nobility was essentially a gentry, like it existed actually in other countries that developed similar, chivalric and military, attitudes fundamentally. So, and Castilla was not exactly, however, the most developed countries economically speaking. They made a lot of money with especially with the herds of sheep and all that the wool was exporting, etc. But that's not actually the indicator of a very evolved dynamic economy. At this time during the 16th century, the most technologically advanced countries in the world are Germany and Italy. The Spanish naturally were in fact expanding exactly into these Italian and German areas, also for these needs. But Spain was relatively depressed, and it was functioning intensively, naturally, not just with its power. Definitely it had, also from an economical point of view, as a big country in Europe, but also naturally with the gold and silver of the Americas, etc. But let's say that at the end of the Reconquista, many of these hidalgos that had effectively been living out of the professional war, now they were without employment. So part of them went into Americas, so exporting even in their mentality this kind of let's say chivalric ideals, but no, chivalric in their own way, meaning that they felt themselves to be noblemen in their own fiefs. New Spain was effectively created in this sense, where the crown actually had a very difficult time to control the expansion in the Americas. Charles V and the Pope were effectively, extremely troubled by the attempt of directing the activity in America in a way that all these adventurers at that point also were doing in their. Some of them joined instead the armies in Europe to go to fight on the European battlefields, and there was this vocation, which is particularly interesting because these were fundamentally noblemen. They were therefore equatable to the nobility of other countries that, however, in many ways was very different. Think about the French one. The French society was completely different. It was there were many, much less, very less, a much smaller, say, amount of noblemen that were enormously wealthier on average. In this sense, the Spanish ones. Now, the Spanish ones were growing also relatively impoverished. The economy wasn't that much at the time. In general, there were crises, the war, expenses, etc. But and many of these noblemen actually joined the army for making fortune in this sense, and they were known as in Spanish as señores soldados. So hired lords, lord soldiers, something like that. So these gentlemen were actually prevented, even given their economical status, their strange circumstances in general, to even fight on horseback, like the true caballeros, in fact, have ideally to do. And this is particularly interesting because they often served even as infantrymen, although remaining very stern custodians of the chivalric mentality, which is very interesting because at this point the Spanish infantry was not like the other infantries. It was imbued in part with this idea of nobility, of courage, of honor. The tercio members were particularly proud of their and the fact that they were actually volunteers, and that allegedly there wasn't even a punishment for desertion. Excuse me, a punishment for desertion, because the idea was that, if you abandoned the tercio, you were not a true man. You were not a true gentleman in this sense. So you were ruined forever, because kind of all the other gentlemen knew about it, and you were treated like scum. So there is all this very, in fact, chivalric mentality at the base of such attitudes. So naturally, actually, early modern warfare is very, very fascinating, because now I'm making it simple, but this idea that the nobleman had to serve from the lowest ranks at one point was present even in other countries, and even relatively late in time. Think about the imperial commander Raimondo Montecuccoli, that has been one of the greatest commanders in modern history. He fundamentally he started his military career, as it was wanted at the time, even as a nobleman, starting as a pikeman. So in order to share the sufferances, the knowing what the craft of war actually was from the lowest, from the dearest, conditions. And in that case, he was an Italian that was serving the Austrians at that point. Obviously they were together also with the Spanish. So that was generally also something shared by other areas of Europe. And so we would have to go a bit more in detail into that. But it was nevertheless particularly important, because at this time the noblemen actually fought at every rank of the army during their career. So this also demolishes the stereotype that the classist perceptions of history, where the nobleman was just a guy eating getting fat with food, where the poor soldiers that were hired were just starving to that. And no, there were people who consistently suffered in the same exact way like their soldiers, naturally, in order to make a career, so to make it better. And today we will see it particularly, especially with Guzmán de Alfarache. So as a consequence, every company, let's say every captain of in the Spanish army tried to give even a certain tone, a certain fame, to a certain prestige to his company that was raised by him, because this is how it still worked, by assuring to it the service of some gentleman. So the hidalgos were perfectly adapting to this, and the one who entered, in the sense, in the company, were called particulares, and they were in fact true foot knights, we can say, foot horsemen, conceptually, foot caballeros, because through their example you understand well how the transformation that the modern age brought, also very much in mentality, because in basically more or less in all the languages spoken in Europe at the time, the term that that was used to name the knight at the time was gradually detaching itself from its original meaning of mounted fighter to load itself with certain values that were drawn from a complex sense of prestige, of dignity, of ethics, of behavior. So at this point, cavalry was living kind of a dark time. During especially the mid-16th century, in terms of tactical balance, the cavalry had regressed pretty much. Then slowly towards the 17th century, towards the 18th, cavalry regains ground in many ways for also tactical developments that we can't talk about now. But I mean, it's kind of known. This is the time of the Reiter, the idea that the cavalryman is mostly a sort of skirmisher, then just attacks towards the end of the battle when the enemy formation is already shattered, because now the combination pike and shot was consistently messing up the tactical role that cavalry had towards the previous centuries. Then eventually, with the decline of the pike, the development of muskets, cavalry comes back. So this was very important, because from the battlefields this was translated into a broader transformation, because now the pikeman, that could be a peasant drone from anywhere, could technically knock out a knight or an arquebusier, could do the very exact same. So now knighthood and chivalry and all the ideals that words really had very potently at this time, however, were shifting from something that was not also tactical. For centuries, Middle Ages, the knight was by definition a mounted fighter. At this time, really not. At this time, there were many noblemen who fought even within the ranks of pikemen into the melee on foot. So this is pretty much it. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. So, as we were saying before about the Hidalgos, not all of them were particularly wealthy or powerful. Actually, the Spanish gentry was fundamentally made up by many individuals who had even decayed, socially speaking, were poor, and there is all a beautiful literature that today we'll just give a small gaze at. So there were many noblemen that were not even a particularly high rank by themselves, however, there were still some major figures in them that participating to these food companies at this point gave an enormous prestige to the Spanish infantry, because it was at this point believed, especially in the second half of the 16th century, to be the best foot soldiers in Europe. And therefore here you mix it's important to be a nobleman at this time. It's not something simply like a name. Individual courage is limitless, and it's boundless, and everybody, a peasant, like just a nobleman, can definitely behave on the field in the same way, or maybe the peasant even better than the nobleman, of course. But fundamentally, there was an additional prestige that was attached to the nobility that came because there was an actual function the nobility still had in society that was pretty evident, that made society work. This is we will see it very clearly with the passage we'll read. It was a clienteling society. So the idea of having a name, having connections, etc., was very, very important, and participating to the army in this sense gave to the noblemen an option, just another option to extend their prestige, to make money, to ransom themselves maybe from their failure, their economical failure, etc. This is typical. This is a very kind of even romantic topic that remained, historically speaking, also for the modern age, the contemporary age. The nobleman that decides at a certain point to abandon his own life and to go out there to war, to risk life and to die, because it happened obviously consistently. So it was a pretty early modern warfare was a carnage of very, I mean, it's not that other periods were definitely easier, but this was a pretty harsh warfare in many ways, very bloody one. So this attitude of Spanish noblemen became very popular around, and it's followed even in other places. And this brought to the end Also another prejudice that had existed previously during the Middle Ages, that the noblemen had towards foot soldiers. Basically, in the Middle Ages, where fought on foot was considered, at least on a regular pace, because they didn't have a horse, didn't know how to fight on it, were considered almost subhumans. We have to be very honest about this. The nobility was extremely full of itself, even at the level of proto-racism. The nobility was actually convinced that they were superior from a biological point of view. I'm not saying this is actually true, because it doesn't mean anything. It would be racist to say, but indeed there had been some sort of even physical selection in this nobility. Growing to be part of nobility for generations and generations in the Middle Ages meant that you had to be at least, pretty robust, pretty consistent. There was some kind of biological selection, and had brought the nobility to be. But obviously it was mostly a political and social and economical preeminence that made this men more fit for instance, for the task of command, that they were educated to since childhood. The military art. The peasant conscripted was forced in the army was a guy that knew realistically just how to plow his field. These young men were trained into the art of war, in also logically also in different ways. But they had this social push for this pressure for saying, okay, you have to cover that role, and you have to be responsible for it. The classist myth that the nobility in fact was a sort of parasite class is completely devoid of any grounding, historically speaking. These clienteles all worked with a for the sake of a redistributive criterion, for which of course the nobles craved off from the top, but they had necessarily, if they wanted to survive as politically, sometimes even militarily, they had to reinvest continuously into their assets to better it, and there was a very fierce competition. And as we will see, in fact, being a noble didn't at all equate to seal in gold. To be extremely, to be rich by definition. It wasn't the case. They wished they had been, and we'll see now. But it's important that even the noble mentality kind of opened up to the idea of belonging to a foot force. Because as we have seen now, the noblemen were fighting alongside also the commoners into these armies on foot, in the pike forest, let's say, on the ground, with bullets flying all over, cannonballs smashing into their ranks, etc. So it was a way even to acquaint a little bit. You see how war hybridizes culture in many ways, and how it brings to know new things, how to open to new ideas, to confrontate with different situations. And this was definitely also a moment of humanistic ideal in many ways, always given for the stress in it that the nobility still had huge and enormous and deeply rooted prejudices towards the commoners, towards these people were considered inferiors. But nevertheless, the case of Spain at least is a pretty good example of how this nobiliary prejudices were being at least challenged by the reality of facts, essentially. And this is important, I would say, because it doesn't start necessarily with this time. It wasn't something peculiar of the Spanish Tercio. You can find even into the 14th and the 15th century example of very heavy knights at this time, full plate armor and stuff like that, dismounted when they had to fight. Just think about the English armies of the 100 Years' War, of the War of the Roses. They consistently had this ability that actually they had never lacked, but since the very beginning of cavalry, of being able to dismount and technically fight still also on foot, also because they were perfectly trained to do that. And it's kind of ironic in many ways that the same pike and shot tactics, especially the pike one, was in part triggered by the same use of foot noblemen. back in the day, because for instance at the Battle of Arbedo in 1422 it was the Milanese horsemen that in order to deal with the Swiss infantry that at this time didn't still quite have all pikes, they were like at 1/3 in proportion, they still had mostly halberds and other even shorter pole arms. They dismounted the Vogue, for instance, the Swiss Vogue. They dismounted and they engaged the Swiss infantry on foot and defeated it bloodily, actually. And it's very interesting because it happened all the time. That and this triggered actually in Switzerland the decision, the reform that eventually brought from the 20s of the 15th century. In fact, Arbedo is kind of the watershed to this idea of increasing the number of pikes. So to have by the mid 15th century this Swiss infantry fighting essentially only with pikes that also required a much higher degree of training. But now we will have to cover that history. But just for saying that paradoxically was born out of having fought against noblemen that dismounted with their own lances, they used them as pikes fundamentally. Even breaking them or readapting them, because objectively the noblemen had been used to fight with any kind of weapon in any single kind of situation. The idea that the nobleman was just a guy that fought on foot and was fought on horseback, and that was not able to fight on foot or to have other skills is nonsense. Noblemen were trained to fight by definition. They were the embodiment of professionalism. They could fight in any single way with any kind of weapon, especially including firearms, and you can find it all over. Even the myth that the nobility didn't use weapons like crossbows or later handguns is completely false historically. So we have seen how the tercios of Spain became some sort of national corps, made up by, I would say, taciturn, frugal, and disciplined soldiers that during the wars of Italy and the ones of Flanders gave great proof of authentic valor, as kind of we all know from if one knows that military history, etc. And yet they remained throughout all this period, and partly that's the reason because of their success and kind of their primate, in the sense that the rest of the other European armies remained even up to the 18th century, up to very late sometimes, depending on which country. They usually remained a sort of mosaic of peoples that in which the conflicts triggered very particular dynamics. Were actually very logic ones as well. If you take it from a geographical point of view, there were sometimes certain shifts of masses that went to fight into other countries because, in fact, of trying to run after fortune. This was a moment consistently of mercenaries. The mercenarism is not something that dies out with the modern age at all. Definitely the 18th century saw the rise of this consistent kind of national permanent armies, but even in the case of that simply meant that there was a state now, not as a group of noblemen that kind of summoned troops on behalf of the crown. We talk actually about the crown that starts seizing progressively, especially in certain countries like chiefly France, but later naturally powers like also Spain, but Austria, Prussia, etc., Sweden since the 30 Years' War actually, almost together with France, and that I don't remember how the phrase was finishing that. However, we're still hiring fundamentally foreigners. So you have to think about these great masses of disinherited that really search for fortune everywhere. If you have watched famously the famous Kubrick's Barry Lyndon, you see that. very easily in the 18th century warfare how the nationality of an army wasn't actually on the base of, of where you actually came from as a soldier, but who was summoning that army, who was recruiting that army. So that, I don't know, even in the armies of Frederick the Great, you don't have just Germans. You have even there Polish, Italians, French, so people who came from everywhere, because that's how normally it was full of people that really were so poor. They went abroad in many places. Just think about the Cossacks of the Don River. There were so many assassins, criminals, other people that were kind of outcasts from Western civilization who did what? I don't know. Maybe they went into the Ottoman Empire. Maybe went with the Cossacks in the Ukraine. And because it was normal. At that point you had to find a living, and if you didn't find it close to your home, you went abroad. So these dynamics were actually iron logical. And through them you can understand much of the socio-economical, other than just political dynamics, political military dynamics of modern Europe. A great problem of this also, let's say leave aside the market of war in itself that definitely had a consistent weight at this time. Mercenarism was always there, but there were even strictly demic problems. I mean, now demic Europe was kind of increasing demically, but it was rising demically, but there were areas that still couldn't satisfy their own recruitment needs with just the local population. It's not even a matter of how many people actually live in there, but also what they do, how much money they have. You can't depopulate your country if you're still. These are still agricultural systems, by the way. The Industrial Revolution kicks in just in some very few countries into the 18th century. So it was normal for certain crowns to go recruit troops somewhere else. Also because at this time there was a lot of war being fought, so the continuity of this of war was something exhausting from an economical point of view. There were, at this time, all the major crowns in Europe were chronically in debt. The wars were consistently stopped at some time because there was no money. I mean, these systems were literally exhausted themselves. And it's not that there was a huge rate of growth. I mean, at this time, that there were areas of Europe that were, in fact, destroyed literally by... Think about Germany in the 30 Years' War. I mean, literally 1/3 of the German population was wiped out by the 30 Years' War. In 30 years, in fact. So, that's impressive, definitely. And why? Because there were certain areas that were kind of, if you want to, privileged areas, privileged theaters of war. And in fact this went both ways. I mean, there could be countries that were regularly at war, like Spain is a beautiful example of this, that had however a few population. Vice versa, there were other countries who actually didn't have a very, they didn't have an ongoing warfare normally, but they had exceeding demic numbers, and that was also a problem, because if you have exceeding demic numbers, it means that, well, at this time there weren't kind of welfare policies controlling the population. It was pretty complicated even to manage the things like the employment, etc. There was a lot of crime, but people who were unemployed, in fact, and the problem was fundamentally to even get rid sometimes of parts of the population. Always considering that, in fact, a war was an excellent way of that, because usually immigrants tend to bring, either they go die in another country, because that's the point, so they get out of the way, either they bring money back and they bring competence back, they bring in, and this was a world that, as we said before, was increasingly intertwined. So even war was a channel through which a lot of know-how, of technologies, of experience actually poured all the time, consistently. And it was kind of useful, even in times of emergency, to have someone in your ranks that kind of participated to your that had participated to war. I mean, there were certain areas of Europe that were chronically depressed, like, I don't know, take the Celtic Fringe and British Isles. There were lots of Scots or Irishmen who went fighting somewhere else, in countries like Poland, etc. And they actually had consistent political and military interests as well, because maybe they were fighting against England at that time. They were siding with certain other powers. So it was all intertwined. The point, though, is that the majority of soldiers were actually dragged to war by their own poverty. This was kind of a say that existed out there. It was often sung in with a note of melancholy in many works, in many you can find it pretty much everywhere at the time, in literature, even in music and stuff like that. So what happened because of these dynamics is that war established a sort of constant migratory flux from the countries that were in peace to the ones that were at war. So during the second half of the 16th century, you can say that there were certain only certain of areas of Europe, politically and geographically speaking, that were actually at peace, fundamentally, that they were not battlefiels. The majority of conflict at this point in Europe was fought was seen in the Flemish lowlands. Notoriously, at this time, the Flemish lowlands become the battleground of Europe. The reason why it became so is not just because the Flanders were extremely rich, so they were rising actually in spite of all, even of like things like, in fact, the war against Spain that consistently bled itself white, economically speaking, tried to recovering Flanders to rule them with iron fist, but also because of certain logistical reasons. You have to think also of tactics of the time. First of all, strategy. Now, strategy could there were, this kind of early modern states were structuring themselves somewhat. Their crowning were increasing. We're starting to centralize in a modern sense. There was an extremely difficult, actually, attempt to carry this out, to have more money concentrated into the hands of the crown that were devolved like 95% in quantity to war, because war was the first activity of monarchies. That's what they did, and that's how they are developing. There is also the development of artillery, so they require foundries, they require places where to store weapons, to use them, to have a greater logistical organization. Sea power at this point is increasing consistently. As we all know, the Europeans are expanding all over the world, and they have a kind of a longer range capability. I mean, logistically speaking, they can transfer armies pretty much pretty quickly in many ways. The Spanish actually mostly used the Flemish way. It was this road that from Spain by sea they went to Italy, from Italy they went north to the Alps, and then through Germany, the Rhine Valley, and then they arrived to fight into the lowlands, because there was France in the middle, which was kind of was always at war with Spain. And also for the terrain, So Flanders was a kind of a central position in the Mediterranean. It was closer to the main competitors at this time. Spain, I mean, not very close to Spain, but hey, Spain at this time ruled kind of all over the Iberian Peninsula, Italy, and the Flanders were Spanish at this point. The lowlands were Spanish in part. And then there was France in the middle, and then England was close, and then you had all the German principalities relatively close with Austria, etc. So that's what, even during the 18th century, will remain fundamentally the battlefield of Europe. I mean, the countries like Belgium, especially, are kind of have the highest concentration of battlefields in European history. Including Waterloo, for instance, just to say the most famous. But that's how it continued. It continued in World War the First. That's and there were also certain kind of tactical reasons. Partly tactical reasons, because there were lowlands. In fact, and definitely using armies like the ones that were developing in the Renaissance was kind of easier to do there, that in some hilly or mountain area or marshy area. So countries like Belgium were also kind of useful. I mean, in terms of terrain to maneuver big concentration of armies that were aimed usually at, in fact, occupying this major wealthy area of Europe that was so crucial, strategically speaking, and over which, in fact, empires fought for centuries. So there were certain populations were continuously under pressure in the sense. Other two areas of Europe that had seen consistent warfare in this time were definitely Germany and Italy. Italy chiefly during the Italian Wars, during the first half of the 16th century, and Germany definitely in the first half of the 17th century, but they kind of continued to be also this kind of so-called weak areas, because there were two countries were consistently fragmented from a political point of view, and they could be more easily kind of penetrated. After all, also the Netherlands had developed as a kind of a political entity at this time, but they were still pretty much disconnected. Then, of course, we know how history went, but technically the Spanish saw those just as a province. Those were the Habsburgic Netherlands, and they had to be ruled as a kind of a feudal area as they were used. Naturally, the local inhabitants thought it otherwise most of the time. What else can we say about this? So this triggered naturally the shift of humans that came literally from all over Europe to fight in these areas. So most of the Europeans that fought at this time were fighting actually not in their homeland, but they were fighting somewhere else. The methods of recruitment at this point were a big problem. For all the reasons that we listed, political, social, economical, also strictly military in terms of logistical. I mean, you had to shift these troops throughout Europe, literally. At the time, you went on foot. So it was particularly costly as well and complicated, and there were new organization systems that were being developed for this. So there were different systems for recruiting armies at this time. The first, during the first modern age, the systems were actually three, substantially three at least. One is the mandate. One is conscription, and the other one is contract. So a chief of state, at this point, a monarch, could use often, actually, at least potentially, it was always kind of an option, to use foreign troops that were already organized. These foreign troops could actually belong to another government. So they could be even foreigners. So you could hire a, I don't know, company that was literally at the service of another crown, and this could happen consistently also through diplomatic ways. I mean, you just signed a pact with the government from which this company depended, and you hired them. And there were countries that were definitely developing into this. Just think about the Swiss. I mean, the Swiss provided French infantry for a very long time. The French at this time kind of sucked in infantry. They usually used the Swiss for the same thing. The same happened with the Landsknechts in Germany, and being created by the Habsburgs, but eventually they were sold kind of also to other. So the mandate system, starting for the first one, was usually put in motion thanks to certain licenses that were granted by the single governments. So in this license, it was written time after time, essentially, where the areas were fundamentally the recruitment had to be carried out. This was very important because, in fact, it had a political impact, or social, economical, because you had to choose where to recruit troops from, and usually the local populations were all but happy to be hired forcibly. And naturally, this license established also the number of soldiers to hire. In this sense, it was in mandate there was a key figure that was made up by the captain. So the captain was the title holder of the governmental license, and he had actually a very wide freedom. I mean, there were certain captains at this point that were usually also employing part of their own personal wealth in order to create their own companies. Think about individuals like Wallenstein or other great commanders of the 30 Years' War, who were effectively, investing in the business of war. So depending on certain monarchies, but actually doing the whole thing on their own as entrepreneurs. The captain chose, and we're talking about this really at all levels. Obviously, there were greater. Wallenstein is kind of one of the greatest organizers, but there were definitely other smaller captains that maybe was just a company commander. So, but nevertheless, they had a great importance because they were the ones who chose, for instance, the colors of the company. He was the one who went around with his own assistants to go recruiting the people. So showing the license around and examining all the people who actually voluntarily, most of the time, many times arrived to him to ask for being hired. The recruits at this point had to be accepted. They had to swear, because this time that was a normal contractual form. So it was a contract, and you had to be, kind of faithful. This time they were put under martial law, in the sense that they were, literally brought on the field by armed men who could send them to die, fundamentally, and to inflict punishments to them, and so on, to keep on discipline, etc. Usually, we will see now also in the novel, they were paid in advance. At least a part of their pay was paid immediately. Usually, the first monthly pay was given in advance. So then through contractors, you could also recruit through the system even soldiers that were going to fight under the banners of a foreign state. Uh, this is particularly interesting because this tells you that there was an international business. I mean, it didn't happen just within a certain state, because these contractors, once their armies were disbanded after the service, fundamentally they were usually rewarded with the concession of certain pensions from the side of those governments that they had served. So you could technically hire someone from in another place even, or it was very free. It was a very fluid. It was a very fluid system. The recruitment on mandate was even very spectacular in many ways. We will read it from the novel, because the banners of the company were exposed at the publicly, at the windows of the town where the company was being formed. They showed, in fact, there was a very pretty evident signal at the time with other systems of communication that, I mean, look there are people who are going to recruit soldiers. And naturally they also brought kind of movement, because there are people who come there, who sleep in the inns, we'll read it in the novel as well, who make the economy go around. So you have to think that this wasn't even not a completely undetached activity from the local interests, because corruption was everywhere, so everybody was paying for getting their share from this. This was the ancien regime as it worked, and it was normally working like this. I mean, naturally for us, it's bad, right? But at the time, think with a very weak central authority, this was a way to self-regulate yourself. So it was unfair in many ways, but it still worked, and this is what is kind of difficult to understand sometimes. So there were all these, maybe it wasn't that funny all the time, because there were also these masses of needy people who came there to be hired. There were nothing but maybe criminals, outcasts, as we were saying, poor people as well, but also of kind of very, ingenuous patterns that we will read about it now, including those same Spanish noblemen we were talking about before, that went there essentially claiming their own status, and therefore making these tricks even for pretending to be noble. This is typical of this time. I mean, pretending to be wealthier than you were, that you had a title, that maybe you were just a criminal. The Barry Lyndon movie is in that sense very, very accurate, because it shows you this kind of underground of rogues. In fact, we will be reading that novel that is titled The Spanish Rogue in English. So that is essentially what we were talking about. Those kind of rascals were hunting for money, etc. That were naturally exploiting. They were definitely speculating on taking advantage of even of the posts, the offices that they were given within these units. Also, as they were fighting definitely themselves, because they were going to go to war, but we have to think about the braggadocios, the squanderings of first pay received, this colorful rags that were worn just to show, in this competitive system, to prove to be kind of a person of a higher rank than the one you actually were. And this is a word of adventure, and literature has consistently showed this in many ways, with these swashbuckling novels, and the figure of the arrogant, of the cocky soldier at this time is very much alive in the comedy of art. With this figure of the soldier, that it's something that goes back, is actually more ancient than we imagine, because even if you study Latin literature from Roman times, you find this figure of the legionnaire, that is the cocky guy who arrives there, is kind of violent, wants to make money easily, and uses violence. And here is the same exact thing. And just to show how certain things really never change in history. And the picaresque novels are particularly useful to look at this world, because at this time, as naturally also with print, with the general, even the increase in literacy, etc., Europeans were starting to write a lot, really a lot, even in this, and many of these authors had been people like this, I mean soldiers, mercenaries, and they knew how it was, and therefore this universe, especially of training through essentially through swindle, through fraud and scam, is pretty much evident from the Spanish Rogue, that we're gonna read a little bit now to show you exactly what we're talking about. So what we're reading now is from the I think it's the 9th paragraph, or I think the 9th chapter of the second book of the Guzmán de Alfarache. It's this picaresque novel that we were talking about before, written by the Spanish Mateo Alemán, who was born in Seville in 1547, died in Mexico after 1615. And the author is mostly known, in fact, for this work that was published in 2 volumes in 1599 and 1604, respectively, and that also established, if you want, the fundamental lines of picaresque narrative. And the success of Guzmán de Alfarache was enormous at the time. There were so many copies of it. They were plagiarized, in fact, in Spain, in France, in Belgium, in Portugal. It's interesting because this is the story, in fact, of a soldier. At least today we will read when he fundamentally was joining the army into Spain. Today we will look at the recruitment and into this phase, in fact, to go to embark to Italy. And it goes, I mean, the story is very long, and there's typical picaresque novels, and very animated, as you can imagine. The Guzmán de Alfarache is a rascal, fundamentally. He is just a rogue who goes around, and at a certain point he even goes to jail. He has a very adventurous story. The novel is very funny if you want to read it. I think it's published, although I think the English one version you can find it on archive.org is I don't think it's correct. Either it's been modified from the original. I don't really know. And this is all what we need to know, actually, because I don't want to go for too long into this. And here we simply read. So he says, we had traveled a certain stretch of road. By the way, he's telling, I mean, he's in first person, right? So he is the same Guzmán de Alfarache talking about his own adventures. So he says, this is in Spain. We had traveled a certain stretch of road when a traveler informed me and assured me that in Almagro there was a company of soldiers. It was what it took to take away my apprehension and rejoice. Right at the entrance of the town, in Calle Real, I saw a flag at a window. I went ahead and stopped at one of the local inns, where we dined for a while, and immediately went to bed. To recoup some of my bad nights. The innkeeper and patrons, seeing me come well dressed and accompanied by servants, tried to find out from them who I was, and since they knew nothing more than what they had heard from me, they replied that I was called Don Juan of Guzman, son of a great lord of the house of Toral. The next morning I got dressed by my page, adorning myself with my most elegant things, and after listening to the mass I went to visit the captain of the company, telling him how I had come to see him to ask him to welcome me to his service. He received me with great courtesy, and with a benevolent face that certainly deserved that my good looks certainly deserved, as well as my dress and the money I had, a little more than 1,000 reales by now, like the crow of Noah's Ark, profuse in clothes, loves, and travel. He accepted me in his company and wanted me at his table, always treating me with a lot of urbanity. In exchange, I began to splash out in invitations and gifts, throwing away the money with princely indifference, as if I had so many years to be able to risk every Tuesday of my life, or that it was easy for me to find another apothecary to be robbed anywhere, as well as another river or another wood where I could put myself in a safe place. My lavishness was blind. The reales disappeared visibly. I was very often at the gambling tables of the company where, winning a few times and losing a lot, I thinned my pelf more and more. I went on like this until the preparations for departure began. They gathered us in a church to give the anticipated pay to the company. The soldiers came out one by one collecting their money. When they called me, the payer looked me up and down, and finding myself too young, he didn't want to take the responsibility to let my enlistment pass, concerned to stick to the instructions he had received. I was very angry and was about to lose my control and let myself go to words I would later regret. But it was, fortunately, the blaze of a moment, and with a certain mastery of nerves, I said to that man, "Sir, the age is small, but courage is a lot. Whoever controls is the soul, and the arm will hold the sword, because in it there is enough blood to make up for the other deficiencies." The payer answered me with great prudence, "Just like that, Sir Soldier, and I believe in the truth of what you say with more faith than the most beautiful words can give me. But the order I have is this, and if I do not observe it, I will pay from my own pocket." I didn't know what to answer to his good logic, although the blush that anger had made me rise to the face could not be cancelled so soon. The captain resented much of this refusal, and considered it a wrong done to himself. He believed that, by denying me the money, I would have abandoned his company, and turning to the payer, let himself go against him at such an access of anger that if the other had not been very moderate and tolerant, some big brawl would have been born. However, the dispute was settled, and I received the pay. The captain came to see me in the inn, expressing to me with fine words how grieved he was, and leaving me fully satisfied with the repeated statements of esteem. I thanked him very much. Then we said good-bye, and the captain returned to his quarters. The next day the company set off and did not stop until we were in sight of the coast. I hadn't even stopped for a moment in the course to fund my money, and the captain had been of great help to me. I continued in the same way during the 3 months that we were waiting for the galleys. Perseverance in gambling then gave me the coup de grace, and it finally came the day when I saw myself reduced, as they say, with one hand in the front and the other on the behind. How hard it was for me to start over, how grave to bear, how sad to find myself in misery. But the experience I had previously acquired allowed me to get back to work soon. One thing, however, in bitterness, was of consolation to me. and it was the ascertainment that the short period of prosperity had given me a credit which was then useful to me in adversity. And in truth, it did not seem to me a small wealth, falling back into poverty, to see that in all of them the best image of me remained, which each one had conceived in my happy time. The captain kept his esteem for me, grateful for the benefits received, and tried to remedy my misfortune, even if he failed, powerless as he was to remedy his own. And when I realized that my situation was no longer sustainable, I turned into his servant, and he, who had been my companion for a short time, was my master from that moment on. I served him with the same scruple as I had served the cook. He commended me with a certain regard, in consideration of of who I was, and judging that I had fallen at that point by excess of lavishness for my little age, and for having been badly guided during my adolescence, and he was sure that I would never have done in his prejudice and similar actions to a noble person. He considered me faithful and reserved, to the same extent that I appeared to him patient and submissive, so that he made me a depository of his secrets, of which I always kept gratitude. He confided me his need and all that he had spent when he aspired to the position of captain, the endless time and the exhausting effort he had spent to obtain it, praying, corrupting, flattering, serving, accompanying, revering, with his head to the ground, the hat perpetually in hand, the pace always excited, shadow in full dawn at sunset in the courtyard of the palaces. He told me that once, coming out of the royal palace with a courtier, for having put his hat back on as soon as he entered his coach, he had seen himself fulminated by annihilating glances, and the favourite had made him understand his grave disgust by deferring the practice for many days, and making him discount it in money and in pains. My captain touched me with his misery, to which I did not know how to cope with. We know that a poor man pities the misery of others better than a rich man, and above all that of a nobleman. He possessed, it is true, some jewels, which he could have sold to recover a little, but they constituted for him a title of honour, and on the other hand, being on the verge of embarking on a land where they would have been necessary, he regretted discarding much to remedy of the little. In the 3 months that the galleys were not late arriving, the soldiers found themselves lodging in the houses of the various localities. By relating this fact to the confidences confessed to me by my master, I realized where he wanted to get with the ostentation of his great need. And so I gave him the following reasoning. Lord, for direct experience I have good understanding of what good and bad luck, prosperity and adversity are. In my few years of life I have known many changes. For what lies in me I will act with the loyalty I owe to my master and to my honoured person. Worship is not worth it. I will risk my life in his service, and I will sharpen my brain in search of resources that, waiting for better times, are worthwhile to make us pass less than those present. In this way, I assumed that I would achieve results that my strength and ingenuity would not have given hope for. From that moment I did admirable things. For each housing I subtracted a dozen vouchers, from which I then obtained no less than 12 royal reales, and sometimes I came to have 50. I had free entrance to all the lodgings, where not even the water from the well was saved from my hands. My master permanently disposed of chickens, roosters, capons, and lovebirds, both at lunch and dinner, and a whole loin of pork cooked in wine every Sunday. I never took anything for myself from my raids. I always came back to my master with all the begging. If in any of my battles the host caught me, there were two solutions. If the stuff was a few, it would pass for a childish joke. If the booty was plentiful, the punishment consisted in this: my master made me take and handcuff in the presence of the plaintiff, and with a show of thin soul gave me a long lesson. But it was a lesson that sounded a lot and aged little. Sometimes someone interceded for me and ended up forgiving me, but even when the patterns were missing, the punishment was not rigorous and did not raise sore on the body. I then, knowing that they punished me more by form than by desire, before they touched my clothes, I raised such cries to make the house come down. In this way, my master fulfilled his obligation, and I the need of both. I also chose the main roads by seizing wagons, horses, and mules. Then I let myself to be persuaded to return them, persuading the masters that I put myself at great risk by making that exception to the regulations, and they paid the favor in cash. I tried to collect as many ransoms as I could from the beasts who gave us in the villages, so I took them out of circulation and said they had escaped. On visiting and pay days, I used 5 or 6 young men to collect as much money. It was sometimes the case that by re-entering one of them to church from the back for 5 times, I managed to get him to collect 5 coins, changing his habit, and the last one by sticking a plaster on his nose, to prevent that so much impertinence revealed the scam and laid bare my malice. With these and similar shenanigans, I gave back to my captain how much 4 operations of levy would have given him, and he, in fact, held me there as the light of his eyes. But he was great spendthrift, and my earnings were drops in the sea. When we arrived in Barcelona to embark, he found himself disheartened, without a penny, or prospect of being able to procure, since my roguery could not help him in that city. So I think that this actually the translation is mine, and I don't think it's such a great translation, but I think it's enough to understand the general concepts. Now, what is interesting here is naturally many things, we won't be repeating them, but we have seen how the hiring, the recruitment operations actually worked. We have seen the flags at the windows, we have seen the pay given in advance, we have seen the role of the captain that presides to all of this. We have seen, most importantly, this bond that basically exists between the captain and John of Guzman, that basically presented himself as a nobleman with his servants, with good clothes, and that starts entering to the grace of the captain by spending all his money at once. So this is particularly interesting because he is effectively buying the captain's favor and friendship at the end of the day. It's a way, this way of spending money is an investment to enter into the company with a higher rank. As a nobleman, as someone who in fact was in charge of the recruitment in itself, of collecting the food and stuff, and he ends up stealing and giving all this money to his captain. So this would ensure him a sort of of protection from him. That was the most important thing at this point. And what is particularly interesting is that this investment is particularly evident when he says that even though he had exhausted all of his money, he still found that he had received he still was remembered fundamentally by the others, with those who had enjoyed also his munificence, his positive idea. He was remembered for being a nobleman, someone who had money, who had a name, who had some prestige. Then also, nobody is a fool in here. As long as he finishes the money, he enters, he said it, the commander was my companion, you know, we've seen the gambling tables, all this stuff. Then I became his servant, because at that point the money was over, so if he wanted to remain in the graces of the commander, he had to do something with this. It's funny because the captain actually keeps spending money, so he was another person that had kind of made all his career, has paid his dues, let's say, to reach the level of captain. But in spite of this, wealth that could pour in his hands through his assistants, like John de Guzman, he was still very poor, and he kept spending lots of money. And we can imagine, actually, for the very same reason, in proportion in the hierarchy, that John was doing with him for raising to this. So this is the figure, definitely, of a brilliant example of a clientelary society into which munificence repaid everyone. But I think that the most fascinating part is the one that obviously he put more even emotional emphasis on. That was the one in which the captain tells him how much he had to struggle, in fact, and to suffer in order to reach the post of captain. And we understand that the captain was of a higher rank because he had been working for a courtier at the royal palace. So this is particularly interesting, and he was working in the royal entourage, but nevertheless this costed him a lot. Here he uses this beautiful terms. He says he confided me his need and all that he had spent while he aspired to the position of captain, the endless time and the exhausting effort he had spent to obtain it. Praying, corrupting, flattering, serving, accompanying, revering, with his head to the ground. Now these were noblemen, so just imagine what it meant to be so servile. The hat perpetually in hand, the pace always excited, to show that he was kind of quick and reacting. Shadow, this is beautiful, shadow in full dawn at sunset in the courtyard of the palaces. This is beautiful, because I think we all spend time like that at dawn, somewhere in some bureaucratic palace, to have things done, to be in the hands of some terrible, individual that has to decide of our future during an exam, or our, obviously this is kind of more dramatic. And there is this other detail that made me reflect, because he says, he told me at once, coming out of the royal palace with a courtier, for having put his hat back on as soon as he entered his coach, he had seen himself fulminated by annihilating glances, and the favorite had made him understand his grave disgust by deferring the practice for many days and making him discount it in money and in pains. So this is particularly important because in these clientelary societies, in the lack of a greater, central direction of all this career, let's say, there were even this kind of formal behaviors that were looked at, this etiquette, the informal and unformalized etiquette, for which, you had never to cover your head with your hat, while your patron was there. Just because if you did it, you broke this, you broke the hierarchy. You substantially didn't pay him the due respect, and you are out of there. And therefore, he had it to pay it in money and pains. So this is very dramatic. And there is also the money part, because the dramatic thing in here is not that you were paid; it is that you were the one who had literally provided the money. This is not a corrupted system where there is a lot of money from the above that pours in, because the higher echelons actually do not have money. It's you who has to provide to them. So, and therefore you can exploit those who are under you to get money in turn, like the captain he is doing here with Guzman. So this is dramatic, because in the whole picture, this is still a military. This is still an officer in the army. He's not. He's not. Getting anything particularly better. No. He is probably getting access to a business that is partially remunerative. We see how Guzman, who is a rascal, but he doesn't take anything from his stealing. He gives it all to his captain, so that the captain had, as they say in here, where's the part with the food that he said that on his table, thanks to Guzman, every time at dinner and at lunch, the captain had chickens, roosters, capons, and lovebirds, and on Sunday, a loin of pork cooked in wine. So he's enjoying these privileges. He's objectively privileged, but at the same time, he's still without money. He's still not having kind of a good life, and ultimately he's also going to fight somewhere. So this is a brilliant picture, in my opinion, of the misery of this world, of a world that really worked like this at all levels of society. Sometimes we think, there was this man of power. We had so many, wealth and surplus. No, because probably they would have got out of the way if it was the case. This career was a nightmare, and this is actually the same in real life also today in some measure, but obviously is much better today than at the time, because there are kind of more meritocratic structures, life quality is way higher, but this was the life at the time. And this was the life at the time also because there weren't other permanent structures like centralized states, stuff like that, that they were starting to develop just at this point. But the whole thing has still to be built, usually from the bottom, not really from the top. I mean, bit by bit. And the whole system was still clienterly at this point, just with this kind of prototype of centralized state, was this embryo of centralized state. It was developing progressively, and this is pretty much it. But then you can read the whole novel if you're interested. But I think that this passage was particularly interesting because it shows you really the reality of it. It makes you see how misery was everywhere, how there was no easy life at the time anywhere, and also the systems of recruitment that are kind of interesting, and and then it goes on the story and whatever. But I think for today it's enough. We will deal with such topics definitely in the future as well. We will keep covering really everything as possible, and I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.